I'm John Travis in Mullumbimby, New South Wales on the 9th of December, 2020, talking to Dave Paxson in Conway, South Carolina, where it's still only December 8th.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to find out more about who you are and why. I met you, 6-7 years ago that I remember. You remember an earlier meeting that we'll get to that. You're of my generation, of the pioneers. I didn't know you early on, but it feels like we're soul brothers. We're both very intellectual, and we have very common interests. So let's
Lots
start
of common
with,
friendships that did not come from between us, but
yeah.
we just know the same people.
Yeah. Well, let's start with where you were born, what your parents did, how they influenced you, siblings, early
Okay.
school, the environment that shaped you that led to your career.
How's that old joke? I started life out as a child, but actually I started out as an embryo and then I became a fetus. And then I was born in Baltimore, Maryland in July 14th,
Well,
1949.
you don't say Baltimore, you don't say it right.
Baltimore, Maryland.
Mullen.
I was born literally a half a block from Johns Hopkins University there at Union Memorial. I know a lot about my birth. I wish everyone would know a lot about their birth. That's part of my story. And I know a lot about my birth because of two reasons. At the time I was born, my father he was a young executive with Esso, which became Exxon later.
Uh-huh.
And he had been in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge and all that. He was an only child. His father had been in World War I and was so severely damaged that he spent the rest of his life in the VA hospital. So my father was basically fatherless. So he had his mom. But we lived in Baltimore. And my mother at the time was a public health nurse. She had grown up in Appalachia and then moved to Miami to go to nursing school, was ready to go to Okinawa to be a nurse, and then they dropped the bomb. Both my parents both my parents say that if Truman had not dropped the atomic bomb, they wouldn't have met, and I never would have been. But what's interesting about my mother, she always knew she wanted to be a nurse and wanted to be a healer. And she also, at the time that she was a public health nurse in Baltimore, dealing a lot with children, she knew she wanted to be in obstetrics. So she kept very detailed diaries of her pregnancy and my very early life, which are now in my possession. She died in 2013. I grew up in Baltimore. When I was between the ages of 7 and 9, my parents separated and then eventually divorced. I would think that's probably the most significant thing of my life. My parents' divorce. It was, by that time I'd had 2 younger siblings.
Boys, girls?
I even said if somebody ever wrote an opera called Child of Divorce, it would probably be the saddest opera people would see.
Yeah. Are your younger siblings, you're the oldest then?
I'm the oldest of 3.
Are they boys, girls?
Brother 3 years younger and a sister 5 years younger.
Uh-huh.
My father remarried in 1961. My mother eventually remarried when I was an adult for about a couple of years, but then was mostly. But what's interesting about my mom is while I was living with her alone in Baltimore, she was at Johns Hopkins. And she was head nurse she had worked her way up to head nurse of the obstetrics department. And she was very much, she told me this story one time. She said, and I was young, but she said she didn't like what was going on there. And when she had first started obstetrics, when a woman would come into the hospital, they'd have them out of bed all the time. They'd walk them up and down the hall. Sometimes they'd even take them down 2 floors just to go to the snack bar and then back 2 floors. But the idea was to keep them moving, because my mother always remembered and told me later that she was born because her mother thought she was long overdue, and the people where she lived said, well, what you should do is walk slowly up this grassy hill and then walk back down.
Oh,
Which she did, and nothing happened. And then she says, well, do it again. So my grandmother walked up the hill, and then halfway back down, she says, it's coming, she's coming. And it, or the baby. My mother always remembered that story and seemed to remember the experience itself. But the idea was movement is part of, and she also, over time in obstetrics, all kinds of crazy things would happen. They would start out with them being supine, but then they would raise them and then raise them more and then put them in the stirrups. So this was sort of a thing that happened over time. And so somewhere around 1959, she started complaining, like, because they stopped having people walk, and everybody was supposed to stay in bed. And of course, all the lawyers love this because, well, so that way nobody will slip on a banana peel. Yeah. And she says, well, this is, and she was not vilified. She was teased as being an old timer and, backwards and stuff. Also at that time, breastfeeding was only for the lower classes and stuff. So this was in 59. I'm getting way ahead of myself. Do you want me to talk about my birth and early childhood?
Yeah.
Because in 1959, I was 10 years old. But what happened is she got a transfer to orthopedics. And so she got out of all of that. And she did fine in orthopedics for years. And she was the head nurse again, and she had a 9 to 5. It was the clinic. So she had a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday job. It all worked out. But she always remembered that thing about, the way the doctors would kind of keep becoming more interventionist and more taking over and more of it being about them. Mm-hmm. She was the first person who said to me, and I say to some people, whenever I hear a doctor say, oh, I delivered, 1,500 babies or 2,000 or whatever. And I say, excuse me, don't you mean to say that you've assisted 1,500 women having a baby?
Yeah.
You got men taking credit. I delivered this baby.
Yeah.
Anyway.
The term is the term is sexist and puts the action in the wrong department. Yeah.
And it was interesting. And my father was not in the medical thing at all. He was very deferential to my mother. He was deferential to medical in general, so much so that in his later years, he had a family doctor, and my dad could squeeze a nickel. If he was going to buy a car, he'd go to 5 dealerships. When he bought a computer, he asked 100 people, what computer do you have and what do you like? He shopped, right? But if he goes to the doctor and he was already on blood pressure pills and the doctor put him on more. And I said, well, you ought to go back to him and ask him if maybe he can take you off of one of them, because I did this research for him. And he says, well, no, he's the doctor.
Yeah.
That's in medicine. Everything else, buying a television or a lawnmower, he'd spend weeks and hours. Anyway, I was always stunned by that. But in part of that was my father had a lot of respect for my mother and her knowledge. And when she was also had this weird dichotomy where she would, on one side, she just loved Western medicine because that meant there was a pill for everything. And that meant there was a cure for everything. And, we'll fix you. We'll figure out a way. In 10 years from now, we'll find better ways. And on the other side, she also saw a lot of the things that were really, really wrong. And she just held those two things at the same time. And I heard about this all the time growing up. I considered being, should I get on track to be a doctor? But a lot of things got in the way, including the divorce. And while I was right after my parents divorced, I was with my mother. They put me in an advanced class where I did the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade in 2 years. I did not want to do it, but I was forced to. So that got me all out of kilter. And when I went to college for the first time, I've been there twice, I didn't do so well and stuff like that.
And you were probably younger than your classmates.
Oh, I was much younger.
Yeah.
that meant a lot of things in sports, women, you name it.
Yeah.
I remember when I went to my high school reunion, they gave me a prize because I was the youngest person at the reunion. Of course, I was the youngest person in my graduating
Oh,
class by about 9 months, but okay.
well,
But
I'm curious because I lived in Baltimore. What part of the city did you live in? And
North Central and Towson,
in Towson.
very,
Okay.
very specific place. I've always surprised at all the movies and books that have been written about North Central Baltimore. A lot of them, Ann Tyler, of course, with, the Dinner at a Homesick Restaurant and Saint Maybe, but also Barry Levinson's movies, Tin Man and The Diner. I don't know if you remember
Know
that.
that.
And then right down the street from me grew up a fellow named John Waters.
I lived in the house that John Waters moved out of on Old Court Road at Joppa Road.
Holy shit.
Our neighbor said that he had just moved out, and
Yeah.
I didn't know who he was. This was
You didn't know who he was.
since 1970. He
Yeah.
hadn't made his splash yet, but there were some pieces of celluloid in the basement that he hadn't swept out. So that was a cinch.
That could probably be valuable by now.
Well, they went in the trash.
Especially if did you ever see Pink Flamingos?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I
And,
grew up in that neighborhood where there was shot.
Really?
He eventually bought a mansion there.
I thought he did most of it in that suburb just north of the Hopkins, west of the Hopkins campus.
Hamden?
Hamden, yeah.
Yeah, he did some there. He did some of his other movies there.
Yeah.
He did it also in Clifton Park, which was just east of that area.
Have you been to the Museum of Contemporary Art with the more than life-size statue of Divine? It's
no, but I've heard about it. I've heard about it.
Oh, I've been to that museum twice. It's
Yeah.
amazing, amazing.
I have these tremendous memories of North Central Baltimore. I mean, I could tell you a story, which is basically I lived in Govans, Roland Park, Homeland.
And azaleas in the springtime and
Gosh, everywhere. Yeah. It was weird because my mother was kind of working class as a nurse in Baltimore. At that time, my father was over in DC, moving up in Exxon. And so I really was an upper middle class kid, but of a divorced family and mixed family. And my mother was solidly middle class, but where we lived was always around rich people. And, so there was an element of like,
What
kind
high
of
school
looking.
did you go to then, and what was that like?
Jeez. What was what like?
What high school? Were you a nerd, a jock, a big man on campus?
No. In junior high, when I was age appropriate, I was pretty popular, and I was on sport. I did sports and stuff, and had a couple of girlfriends. And then when I got into high school, when I was sort of behind everything, I was kind of, although I always prided on myself, I'm one of those people, there's a few of them, I can join any group, and I spent some time with everyone, and mostly out of curiosity. So I hung out with the nerds for a while, and then I'd hung out with the brains for a while, and then, but I was also behind the gym smoking with the hoods.
Jack of all trades.
Yeah, no, I was able to easily, like Zelig, the thing was one time.
Yeah.
That's who I was. The one thing I did notice, and the reason I felt that I did that, and this just came up the other day, and I was talking to a friend about, are you paying attention? And yes, I am. And then I said, I've been paying attention all my life. And I remember when I was young, I would keep looking around for other people who were paying attention, sort of saying, like, observing life as it goes by rather than just being in it. And
it sounds like you might be a Scorpio.
No, I'm a Cancer. You're talking about 3 or 4 people or 5 people until I got older, and then I sought them out, you know. But and people, I was a big reader. People always joked about me being book smart but not street smart, but I was as street smart as anybody else was. But I guess that was intimidation factor for them or whatever. But people weren't asking the question, why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? This one lady, one girl I knew one time says, like, you know what, you're like wanting to stop the car every 10 miles and look under the hood to see how it works. I said, what's wrong with that? She said, you can't live life like by that, you know. And most of the people I know would, you know, if you quoted Socrates and says the unexamined life is not worth living, and they'll immediately come back with, yeah, but the over-examining life can't be lived. You know, there was always that counterbalance. I didn't have a lot of people that I felt like. I did have my grandmother, my dad's mother, who was very, very energetic, and I could feel her energy. I eventually got to the point where I stopped thinking about our energetic connections, you know, that exist in bioenergetics, because it just wasn't anything people had a relationship to or talked about, you know. People just, I mean, if every negative word that you can have for somebody who's introspective and taking a look at life from, you know, 30,000 feet or however you want to say it, or just simply trying to, I think I knew when I first heard the word social science, I said, that's what I want to be, a social scientist. And that's actually one of the big things that happened to me. It happened to me in 10th grade. But that's been a theme. It still is, even at this age. I don't know, you know.
What happened in 10th grade? Say more.
What happened in 10th grade? Okay. Wow. Well, I moved out of North Central Baltimore and moved in with my father. My mother basically kicked me out. And I think part of it was she was interested in this guy and she knew the guy didn't want to have a stepson. And so she basically did things and said I was becoming incorrigible because I did things like come home late from school one night when there was a basketball game. And that made me a juvenile delinquent who's, you know, probably should be sent to the Maryland State Training School for Boys. Anyway, she was drinking a lot then too. And then the guy eventually dumped her. So, and she went nuts when that happened. But the guy was very well off. He was a doctor, you know, pillar of the community. So I ended up in January of 1964 I lived with my mother and my sister in Homeland. And then I ended up in Rockville, Maryland, you know, at this brand new school with my brother, stepbrother, and two stepbrothers and a stepsister, and then eventually a half sister came along in 1963. But it's just something that you remember. I remember the spring of 64 so well. I was in this, back then I was in 10th grade. My favorite subject was social studies. And I really bonded with the teacher, really bonded, because he knew I was, you know, and it was actually called The Problems of Democracy. I remember it to this day. That was the name. We spent a whole year talking about the problems of democracy, but it was all social studies and civics and that kind of thing. And I'll never forget this. In March of 1964, and I won't say this, the first book, before I moved, and I was 13 and 14. Before I moved, I went through confirmation at the Church of the Redeemer, an Episcopal church. And at the very end, one of the counselors who was teaching us the class gave me this book, Emmett Fox, The Sermon on the Mount. And basically and this has come up in recent days too, but it's talking about like everything you've been taught is really distorted about God, about Jesus, you name it, the Bible. but this is what it's really all about. And I read it and I was amazed. And that really changed me. It really gave me a big question mark about all things traditional religious.
Mm.
And I noticed that a lot of the people around me either thought religion was irrelevant or it was super important. But grew up in a mostly Catholic Irish neighborhood. So I go to Rockville, Maryland, in a very new, first house, new suburb, new school that had only been there about 3 years, called Robert Perry High. And so this guy comes to me in March and he says, I've got a book I think you're going to like. Now, this guy was very big, but when he died, they didn't really say anything about it because he died the same day Kennedy was shot.
Mm.
And that was Aldous Huxley.
Oh, yeah.
And so he gave me the book, Brave New World. And I read it in 2 days. And I was just amazed that, not only did I already know I wanted to be a social scientist, but I said, you can live your life like this guy lived his life. It's interesting that I have in my head, but I haven't written much. And that is, you can create alternate futures and you can talk about all of the social issues by creating social science fiction, I call it.
Mm.
There's social science fiction. And I said, I can do this. This is cool. What a great way to spend my life is to do something like it, which I may eventually do before I pass. But I will tell you, it's funny, the things that I can remember from a very early age, knowing that I probably would not have children, and I never have. It's just a feeling that I had, right? And also that I would do more of my significant work that meant anything for the world much, much later in life. And that was because that was the way it has to be, because it takes a lifetime to put all this stuff together and to have it all experienced. And I had those feelings at age 7 and 8. I said, gee, I better live that long if I'm going to accomplish anything. I have, there were times in my late teens and early 20s, it was, oh God, the way I'm living, with drugs and you name it, I'll be lucky to live till I'm 30. Well, I made it and tack on another 41 years. So that was a big deal. And, and you can edit this out, but I think it's an important question physiologically. This was the March of 1964. I was 14 years old. And within a week after reading this book, I had basically my first wet dream that I'd ever had in my life. And why I think that's significant, and it's just, people think that's titillating rather than, or who needs to know such thing, if it's anything of that nature, is I think that between like the ages of 13 and 16 is this ideal time where you've got hormones and other drugs in your system naturally that make you extremely susceptible to neuroplasticity. And so things may work and you may make accomplishments, from ADHD to any other problem that you can think of, can work better in that 13 to 16 era than they can any other time in your life, except for maybe the first 6 months of your life or the first 2 years when you're extremely neuroplastic and your brain is growing like crazy. And so it's a window. And I think it was simultaneously with me becoming what I called myself an introspective person, and maybe the most introspective person I knew. And it's odd because at the same time, when I eventually did Myers-Briggs, I was one of the most extroverted people you could be. So introspection and extroversion are not incompatible.
Yeah.
They're not. but I finished school in Montgomery County in Rockville. And then and then my dad moved back to Baltimore, only way out in Hunt Valley, if you know where that is.
Yeah, I
And
do.
I went off to the University of Maryland for about a year and a half, did absolutely terrible. It's hard to pass when you don't go to class or show up for tests, you know. And then I just sort of dropped out and ended up being drafted. And once I was drafted, I got scared that I said, so I went to an Army recruiting center and said, can I get in the medical corps by choice and be a medic? Because I had also tried to be a conscientious objector based on I have a significant amount of Quaker in my family line. But I was not raised as Quaker. I was raised first as a Lutheran and then as an Episcopalian. And he said, yeah, but you'll have to tack on an extra year from from being drafted. This was 1968. So I did it. It just seemed like the thing to do. And I became not only a medic, and then I took a more advanced training because it was to become a nurse, because they were desperate for them in the combat areas. I ended up in an evacuation hospital in Japan from 69 to 72. But what's interesting, there was a lady I met, a nurse in the Army. Well, one of them I married and was married to for 10 years. She was also a war buddy because she went through the same things that I did in a MASH type unit, you know. Did you ever see the TV show China Beach?
Oh yes, I love that.
That was my experience.
Yeah.
As an enlisted, as a nurse, we had quite a few male nurses there that were all trained by the Army. That was my experience. But there was people there that I met at a reunion, and somebody at that reunion in the 80s had showed me this book and knew that I was interested in this. She had remembered this as something. Birth Without Violence, Le Boyer.
Yeah.
And boy, was I off to the races with, and I showed it to my mom too. And she said, oh yeah, that's so true. And she says, why do you think I got out of obstetrics and stuff? And went to, I love orthopedics. It's just, you know, it's down to earth.
Yeah.
It is broken bones and broken backs. But so somewhere around, so I got a divorce in 1984. And I was single from 84 until 94. Married to my present wife, which you have met and come and visited our house. We've been together.
Well, let's go back during the period of your 10-year marriage. What were you doing after you left the Army?
Okay. When I left the Army, I had dated this woman in the Army. She was a nurse and I was a nurse, but she lived in New York, and she was out of the discharge about 5 months before I was. And then I just never heard from her. And then boom, out of the blue, she calls me at my father's house and says, oh, I'm coming looking for work at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. You want to get together, or do you want to go with me? So I actually went with her, and she got a job like that as a cancer nurse at NIH because of her experience as an Army nurse. Mm-hmm. And while I was in there, there were all these job things up on the thing, including a nurse for research tech. And so I went and, did you ever go to NIH in the clinical center? Know anything about that?
Not sure. I've been at the Park Lawn building in Rockville, but
yeah, well, that's that. Yeah. They're all connected. Yeah. But we were both, she was on the 4th floor, I was on the 10th, and she was in cancer. And then we got an apartment. She got an apartment, and then I was commuting at first from North Baltimore and staying here and there. And well, I wasn't sure I was going to keep this job. I eventually did keep it for about a year. And but then I moved in with her. And it was an interesting time. It was psychiatric research. I was part of the group that basically did all the protocols and testings, including things like taking blood samples and doing sleep studies and hair trimmings for the approval of lithium for manic depression.
Oh,
This was in 1973 and 4. And then I got sick of it. I got tired of medicine. I remember. And my plan was, oh, and the other thing, in the meantime, I had tried to get the GI Bill, and it didn't come, and it didn't come for almost a year. So I ended up going to my congressman and all this stuff. And then boom, I get it all in one check. So I quit my job and went to school and started taking 18 credits at the time, because I was back in university. I was back in school. I had a lot of catching up to do. It was interesting. The registrar there, the dean, was saying, like, you know, he looked at my Army record and he says, he gave me like 18 credits and things like health and physical therapy and all this stuff.
now you're in College Park, or where? What
College
campus?
Park. Yeah, I was living in Wheaton. And then we got married because we were living together. And then we got married, and she was going to NIH, working lots of times nights. I was going to school doing 18 credits, using the money that I got to pay my share of the rent. We had the biggest conflict we had. She wanted children, I did not. It's funny, I can remember going back. I got to go back to around age 9. Now, my dad was one of these people who liked to whine about what a burden children were.
Well, that's great.
You know, no, he used to talk about, well, in little ways, you know. I remember in high school, you know, I was on track team and I had to buy my own track shoes, and then buying clothes, and I had to have Ouija loafers and a Madras sport coat. And my father was, God damn, you have to spend this much money on clothes, you know, and then the food he put on the table. He was kind of a, you know. So finally I had this thing one time, and oh, this is maybe later. I said, he asked like why I didn't have kids when I was about 26. And I said, why would I have kids? He says, what do you mean? I said, you always complained what a bad idea they were and what a burden they were. And the kids were always unhappy. You knew that, didn't you? What do you mean by that? Anyway, so we get to, like, if the parents don't want to have the kids and the kids don't like being in the world, why have kids? Why even be here? He just, I think I twisted his brain into a pretzel. I was able to do that a couple of times, you know, and then he went back to like some crazy thing, but would never acknowledge that he was not a gracious parent. Let's put it that way. For example, his mother died in 1958 and left college funds for the grandchildren, right? Medium substantial, you know, like $5,000 in the 60s could take you far. And he decided that was a mistake, that she created a trust. She should have given all the money to him and let him manage everything. So he just went ahead and did that, and took the college funds and used it to buy real estate, the houses and the cars and stuff like that. And so the money wasn't there when I was going to college. It was one of the reasons I think I dropped out. But
and she's the one you felt really connected with, right?
oh yes, very much so, very much so.
But she died when you were 8?
Yeah, biggest.
Must have been a big blow.
It was so big. I went to something, and it may have been a birth workshop, or it may have been just simply one of those Est. Do you remember Est and all that?
Oh yeah, I did Est.
Yeah, and it was something like, but it was a weekend where you go away. Somebody talked me into it, you know, and you're going to solve all your problems in the workshop.
Yeah,
There's a lot of stuff like that, the human potential movement and whatever. But they asked a very good question. And here I am, 28 years old. And they said, okay, what this workshop is about unfinished business. What's the biggest piece of unfinished business you have? I thought for maybe a minute or two, and I didn't know how that was the way you would say it, but basically it was unresolved grief over my grandmother's death when I was 8 years old. And I worked on that the whole weekend. And it was really literally where I got this thing. It was like, okay, at some point in my life. Now, the biggest reason, my mother, I will tell you, when I was living with my mother at the time in Florida, and she came in and told me, and I was devastated for days. I don't think I slept the first night. But my mother's very slowly got into this thing, you know, hey, life goes on, you know. Now, she was not close to my mother, her mother-in-law at all. Life goes on, you know, you can't sit in this stuff. And, you know, there was a very strong message, you know, it's like, well, you're dwelling in it. I love that. Whoever invented the word dwelling, you know, needs to get a smack in the face. Talk about negating emotions. So, but I can remember at the end of that workshop, somebody says, it's like, you know, it's like in your head somewhere, you can look at all these books, and there was a decision you bought into what your mother said about you were over grieving and you were taking it too far and you needed to move past it. And you took all of that and put it on your shelf. It was always on your shelf for 28 years, ready to be taken off when you were ready, if ever. And that's what one person said to me. Somebody says, if ever. Many of these things happen to us as children, ACEs, experiences, and we're never in and people are never in a position. I have gratefully been in such a position, and I say gratefully. People are never in a position where they feel like they have the internal resources to deal with it, and they also have external other people who are supportive of you dealing with whatever the issue is, you know. So how did I get off on that?
Well, the loss of your maternal grandmother.
Yes, biggest thing in my life. Biggest thing in my life. Yeah.
So now we're back with your married. What was it like to be roommates and then decide to get married? Like, how did it shift from friendship to a love relationship? And sounds like an interesting story.
Well,
whose idea was
it? But I will tell you, I don't know if you've had someone in your life. She was very much enamored of me. Okay. And that's a nice feeling.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen a lot. And I liked her very much. I loved her a little bit. We were Army buddies, but there was a lot that just didn't click in terms of interest and other things. And so we just sort of went along in inertia, I guess. I really wasn't looking to get into a relationship anyway. I wasn't looking for something better to come along. And I know she wasn't. And then finally one day she proposed to me. And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, it'd be nice to be married to somebody who's enamored of me, and it's nice looking and pleasant. But we did not have, and I've had this debate in my life, we did not have much of spark or chemistry.
Yeah.
We were very friendly, very cordial, very warm, but no spark or chemistry to speak of. Not for me anyway, maybe for her. But to me, I often didn't feel that. I felt like I was part of her ideals. You know, she wants to be a wife to a certain type of man and have children and go a certain way and stuff like that. And I felt a little bit depersonalized by that somewhat, I think. I will tell you that after 10 years, we divorced. It was the strangest thing. Before we divorced, she begged me on my insurance for her to have this thing called Harrington rod operation. Do you know what they are?
No.
Because she had scoliosis. So one of the things they used to do, but they usually the cutoff date would be like 17 at the latest.
Yeah.
They would put these rods into the back to prevent the scoliosis from getting worse. And she had mild scoliosis. She was in the Army. And then, so what was odd is my mother was kind of for it too. She says, "Oh, you got to do this for her, and Dr. Robinson should do it." Now, Dr. Robinson was the guy that she was going to marry, that stayed with his wife, and but Dr. Robinson didn't do it. He had one of his residents do it. Didn't tell anybody, but he never set a foot in the operating room. But it was weird because Dee was her name. She had it at this hospital on the west side of Hopkins that I had never been to my whole life, even though I'd lived in the town. I had never been over to the west side of Hopkins. You know, I'd been to the Baltimore Museum of Art, you know, and I'd been to the zoo. But then if you go
about the Homewood campus or the medical campus?
Well, no, it's a hospital.
Yeah, but there's the medical campus downtown where the School of Public Health and
yeah, that's where my mother worked. Yeah, Johns Hopkins Hospital. This was another hospital, but it was associated with Hopkins in some way. And it was right next. It's still there. I looked at a map of Baltimore. What?
Church Home was where my daughter was born. That's where
it might have been Church Home. Might have been Church Home with, you know, and they did, you know, I just remember visiting her there when she was recovering from the operation. And then she went back to Indiana, which was where she was from. It took us a year to get a divorce in those days. And the first guy she dated in Indiana proposed to her, and then she waited until she was divorced, and she was remarried again within 3 months. Wow. You know, she found the guy, and then the guy was very good to her, and she got into all kinds of problems later in life, multiple sclerosis, rectal cancer, you name it. But and she died, I think, in 2007.
Did she have the kids she wanted?
No. She never could. Because of the scoliosis and other issues, she was really incapable of having children. She found that out later.
You in school. You're now at College Park, University of Maryland, and what were you majoring in? And how'd that go?
All right, I'm out of the Army, and actually I went to Montgomery, a junior college for a year, caught up. Then I spent 4 years in College Park. I spent my junior, senior year, and then I spent 2 years. In the junior year, I forget what my major was, but it was biology, I think, you know, and I was saying, like, when I'm going to use my medic thing and and try to go farther, maybe become a doctor. But I got to tell you, Jack, what was strange at that time, even back then, I didn't want to be a doctor. Partly, number one, is I didn't want to be the kind of person I would have to be to become an MD in the United States of America in the late 20th century. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Exactly. I myself as a recovering doctor.
Right. I worked intimately with these guys all through the Army, and even when I worked in nursing homes to supplement my income and stuff. And the more a second thing was, I got tired of being around the sick. It was like a fatigue. I really have feelings for these people now in COVID now, are doing this day in, day out. But I knew there was something wrong, something inherently corrupt intellectually and in other ways about the profession in the United States at that time, which is all we knew. And at the same time, I admired it the way my mother did. And you know, I used to go down to Hopkins and watch the open heart operations. You know, my mother would get me in, you know, and I was just amazed at, you know, what technology could do and all that. But I was starting to become someone who, and then when I went to this reunion and they gave me the La Boya, and I started, and it was that little thing there. It's like, we do birth wrong. And then it went out and it says, yeah, but they do pediatrics wrong too. And they do geriatrics wrong. And they do all these things wrong. And then later years, so I studied it. Somebody says you should take medical sociology and medical economics. So I took that. And then somebody says, well, you should get into the business side of medicine. So I started taking business courses. And then somebody said, oh, and then I took an anthropology course and loved it. So then I decided I was going to be an anthropologist, and somebody talked me out of that, saying, well, it's really kind of hard to make a living as an anthropologist unless you want to teach it in a college or a high school and there's tremendous competition for those. And I bounced around and bounced around and bounced. And then I really liked economics. And then I liked the medical economics. So I ended up with a business, as a bachelor's in business with a minor in anthropology. But I took the GMAT test, or like it's the thing, the college, the graduate boards and stuff. And I got a scholarship to stay on at the University of Maryland in the business school. So I got an MBA. And the idea was I was going to get into hospital administration or healthcare administration or things like that. And I was going to fix it from that side.
Yeah.
The young are so naive. What?
You and Big Pharma.
Oh yeah, I was going to fix Big Pharma too.
Yeah.
Get a job at Smith Kline and French or something. I even interviewed there and fix it from the inside.
Right.
Using my bioenergetics on people's hearts. And making them less greedy and corrupt.
You got it.
Well, anyway, none of that worked out, as you can imagine. And when I was in graduate school, I'll tell you, it was amazing. I would get into, you do a lot of economics in business school, okay? You do macro, you do all kinds. And you also can take a course in logistics, which is fascinating. And there's a lot of math and statistics in that. And you can do more. So I ended up with this thing of like, yeah, I want to be in market research and I want to be in logistics and all this. And then I just, because I was good at what I did in terms of analyzing data, I got, right out of school, I got picked by the Association of American Railroads to be one of their top economic analysts looking at their competition. And it was a good job, good money. And it started right away. And I said, well, I can try this for a while and see where it goes, and then try to get back into the other thing at the time. I was applying to places like Blue Cross and Blue Shield and things like that, trying to get into the management side of medicine. Never successful with that. So then I went far. And so I eventually got headhunted away from that job with the Association of American Railroads, because most of what I studied was the trucking company. And I worked for 3 years as the director of the American Association of Truck Salesmen. Actually, it was a subsection of a thing called NADA. So I look at my career path and it's like, what are you doing there? But boy, was there a lot to do, particularly in lobbying, Capitol Hill, learning about tax policies, regulations, interstate trucking, and I was good at it. And I even think of this to this day. I would have brainstorms of ways to create, I'm going to try to do this again with Medicare for childbirth and childhood, but to create a legislative package that would appeal to a wider group than what existed at the time, and therefore wasn't getting passed. So, and I tell people, and this literally came to me, I was laying awake at night, staring at the thing, and I was trying, what are we going to do about the taxes on trucks? And hardly anybody knows, but whenever you buy a truck, like if you drive a Peterbilt or a Mack truck, right? You have to pay the United States 12% retail tax, okay? But that's only since 1982. That was my idea. And because the tax before had been 8% on wholesale, and it saved money. I got them to eliminate the tax on truck parts. So whenever it used to be until 1982. And I remember going into this people, where did you come up with this? This is a great idea. And everybody just bought it, like, and I said, well, I was just thinking all night, but it used to be until 1982, if you drove a big truck, like an 18-wheeler, right? And a tire, anything broke, you would go in and you would go to some place where they would fix it, and then you would pay 8% on the parts. And I got that tax eliminated because we now had a higher tax on the sale of the truck when it's brand new.
And it worked out that would work out better overall for the owner of the truck.
The law passed. It was in the lame duck section of it in 1982. I got to meet all kinds of people, from Barry Goldwater to Bob Dole to all Danny Rostenkowski, because they knew I was with NADA, which was a big player in politics back then. Still is. Car dealers, truck dealers. And but what it showed me was that people can be at odds, politically, but if you can come up with something new that gets people on different sides, at least some people, excited, you can get it done. You can get it done. And I remember I worked with a consultant we had at the time. He says, most people don't get it done in politics. They put in a law, they want to see this happen, make it from changing the minimum wage to blah, 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 blah. 9 out of 10 bills never get passed, to get a bill passed, particularly in a lame duck session. But that's where I'm at now. I've been thinking, it's like, I don't know if you noticed today, which is December 8th, was the big rollout day for Biden's health people. Surgeon General, head of Health and Human Services, director of CDC. They were all on TV today, and you can probably see their things tonight. Quite a crew. You would be impressed. The Surgeon General, the new Surgeon General, who happens to be Indian. Well, he's half Indian. India. Okay, not Native American. Gave this long speech that I was listening to on the radio, where he said, I realized that a doctor works better not as an authority figure, but as a partner with the patient.
Radical.
And he says, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be not as a doctor authority figure, I'm going to be a partner, with the public. And we're going to work together.
Good for him.
Good for him. He said it today. I listened in the car and I was thinking, boy, he came out of nowhere. Literally nowhere. His father, his grandfather or something lived in rural India, was impoverished farmer and stuff like that. Well,
let's get back to your finished up. You've got 4 years at College Park and working for the railroads and the trucking company. And
yes. And then and this was about, because it might have been this early, but I was getting all involved with holistic health. It was just drawing me. And that's what I called it back then. That's what everybody called it.
Yeah.
And anything about it, I would read. Did you write anything back then? I probably read it. But I knew about you because you created the American. You didn't create it. Okay. I thought you did.
No,
but you were on the founding board.
Yeah, membership. I wasn't on the board. No.
American Holistic Medical Association, and then there was American Nurses Holistic Nurses Association, and all that. And I still had a nursing license back then, and I got sick of the corporate world. I was single. I was sure something was going to come up, and I just sort of took a sabbatical. And then the sabbaticals came into, I'm not coming back. Literally the idea of going back to that job that I had with the NADA and the truckers, I just didn't like it anymore. And there was a lot of reasons that I don't get into, but I would say part of it is it was time for me to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when somebody put Le Boyer's book in front of me. I've got stuff in my closet that I wrote in the 80s and 90s. It's all about the things that you and I would easily talk about that most people would not. About, how the relationship of the patient to the doctor, and fee for service rather than per capitation, on and on and on and on and on. But the big thing that happened to me, what was the big thing? Oh. Somebody, I'm trying to figure out who it was, told me to go. Oh, somebody who had been in the S stuff says, well, this thing is even better. What is it? It's called womb surround birth work.
Mm.
And the little I knew of it was probably good, because if I'd known more, I might have been a little bit more reticent to do it. And I remember taking my womb surround process workshop. Anyway, so then I got into this thing for a while where I was a consultant to Taylor Manor Hospital, all about addiction. And then I did all this stuff, and I got some social work credits, and I did all this stuff. So I was kind of a consultant for like 5 years, and a lot of the consulting I would get would be train people to be addictions counselors. Now, I wasn't an addiction counselor myself, but to me, it was all so clear. And this is where I go back to the economics and the logistics and putting them together. And you start to see one of the key things about economics is the smart economist always says, okay, when you turn this knob over here, whatever that is, more money, less money in the Federal Reserve, and you turn a knob over there, the whole board changes. Every day the knob on itself turns in adjustment with what you're doing, because there's this homeostasis, and it's a system. And the human body is just like that. And the human body and spirit connecting is just like that. And I was just drawn to anything that talked about things in that point of view. But when I did the process workshop with Myrna, I remember I had I literally, she was able to get me to back to that point of being born through hypnosis and regression, or whatever you want to call it.
Now, just for our viewers, this is Myrna Martin, who will also be interviewed.
Yes.
And worked with Ray Castellino, who has already
Yes.
interviewed.
Yes. And I remember it was a very intense experience. It was an emotional experience. Briefly about my birth, everything was fine. They get to the hospital and they give my mother ether.
Mm.
And everything comes to a full stop, because mom's knocked out on ether and baby's knocked out on ether. and then I'm just in the birth canal. I'm not moving. She's not contracting, because she's like in never land of ether. And I guess I am too. So the doctor pulls me out with forceps.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But anyway, so I experienced all that. But afterwards, and this all happened in a morning, and I'm having lunch with this person who got me into this, and I said, it just came out, and I've written it down, because I told Myrna and I've told Ray, you've got to use this line if you want to. And I was looking out the window, and I said, I don't think ever in my life I felt this close to myself.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I was just amazed, and I was just like, gosh, was an experience like this. I did other work with Myrna where I started to realize that my weight issues were related to me being breastfed for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then switched over to carnation canned concentration.
Oh, that's what I got.
And so get me redirected here, but there is that point where I just said, and this, what I'm experiencing, other people can experience course, they have to be willing, and that's a small
Yeah.
percentage of the population I found. But at the time, I thought, well, everybody's going to want to buy into this. You know, it improves your life. You know,
Well, you've tapped into two areas that I wish were more integrated of holistic, now integrative medicine,
yeah,
and what we call normal childbirth and attachment parenting and all the work that the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children. But how few connections there are that the alternative or the integrative medicine people don't realize that midwifery, the midwifery model, is fundamental to their whole system. And there's no connection that I can see. And you've managed to bridge those two, or found both of them as I have.
mhm.
So that's a commonality we have. But where did it go after the workshop with Myrna, and what were you doing professionally? You've taken a sabbatical and
No, then I
uh,
was working for the Montgomery County Department of Social Services,
oh,
and I was hired to be a trainer, and then they immediately switched me over to being basically a probation officer for people who actually didn't spend much time in jail. So a lot of alcoholics, DWIs,
mhm.
and the idea was if they took our programs, instead of spending 6 months in jail, they would spend a weekend, and you know, and then be monitored by us and things like that.
Uh-huh.
I did that for almost 19 years, for
Oh,
basically,
really?
yeah. And while I was doing that, because I was in this la la land of what they call Beltway bandits, there was so much work you could get in consulting, not as the primary consulter, but doing the like during all the AIDS stuff, there was all this all the data work that had to be manipulated. Same thing was true with some obstetric things, almost any disease. And so I had this knowledge of both addictions, medicine, and statistics, and I found it pretty easy to get to sign on with people. But they would just pay me like $35 an hour or whatever, because and they had the contracts.
I don't know this term, but what Beltway bandits, meaning
People who they get, government has all these contracts all the time. They farm out work,
oh,
particularly
okay.
medical research, to be done by people in public on a contract basis, one by one. And they never have to hire them and pay all the benefits and all that. They just
Oh,
cash
okay.
for the work. And it also, things can happen faster. And you set up a bidding process where 5 different people will tell you, well, this is how we would analyze this data that's coming in, you know, mountains and mountains of data on AIDS, particularly was the thing back then. But it could be other things. It could be a toxic shock syndrome or whatever.
So you were
And
moonlighting doing that and working as
yeah, working
a
full
parole
time
officer.
as I was actually called a um, counselor, but
Uh-huh.
I was a counselor for people who were on release status, and I took went back to Maryland and took a bunch of uh, social work courses and stuff. So it really turned out to be social work, and I did it and I also, but while I was there, and that's the reason they hired me at this place in Rockville, was to train other people to do this, because I had done that for drug and alcohol rehab centers. I'd help them work on their training manuals and things like that, how they would get people to be better counselors. Um,
Now, is this where you met Pat along the way,
no,
or when?
um, Pat met and I met through a mutual friend, who actually the mutual friend actually was also, she and I and 2 other people were joint renting a big suburban house in Prince George's County, and she knew Pat lifelong. Like she was a physical education teacher, so was Pat,
Uh-huh.
and so it wasn't even an introduction like, oh, you should meet Pat, but she says a friend of mine is having a fundraising oldie goldies party, down at Andrews Air Force Base, and and you want to come, you like oldies? Oh yeah, I love oldies, and do the stroll and all that, the twist and stuff. And so Pat was running it, and it's just one of those things. And this is where we do have chemistry in sport, because two things happened. The first thing was when I was waiting outside. Pat was running the whole thing, so she was selling tickets and stuff. So you had to go into this ante room. But and you explained this to me. I still wonder to this day. So I'm standing out, and it's a nice fall night and stuff like that. And I'm waiting to get in, and I'm like, how fast the line moving. And all of a sudden, I got this ringing in my ears. And I was saying, do you hear that? Like it was like a very, very high pitched sound, and it was like vibrating in my whole body. And I remember that. And I said, that's strange. It's like, maybe somebody hit me in the head and I don't remember it. So that wasn't it. So, and then 3 seconds later, I walk in and I go up to the table, and Pat's sitting there with the tickets, and I've got my money out. And I go, and Nancy's next to me, and she says, this is Pat. She's the one who's running it. And she's the one I wanted you to come for, to support her thing. But anyway, I look at Pat and I go, hi. And she goes, hi. And then I go, hi. It's like an echo. Oh. It's just like zzz in the eyes.
Boom.
Boom. And then now she had a boyfriend at the time, and I had a girlfriend at the time. So it was kind of complicated right off the bat. And there's a long story to that. But I will tell you, I spent the whole evening listening to the music and occasionally dancing, but just looking over at her. And she was looking over at me. And then she came over and talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. She says, I got to get back to my boyfriend, or I was going to get pissed off. I'm spending so much time with you. And about 6 months later, I forget exactly why, but I just remember that. But then it's like I was dating a woman in Alexandria at the time. And 6 months later, we were both out of our relationship and ran into each other again at a mutual friend event, and immediately, oh, you're free, let's date. And the rest is history.
All right. How long did it take to get hitched up there?
What's that?
How long did it take after you started dating to be committed?
Well, and this was my thing. We got married, and we had a year's engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I want to do it that way. Do you mind? She says, no, but you wanted to get married. I said, I proposed to her as opposed to first marriage, where wife proposed to me. And no, she was okay with that. I said, so that way we're just like, we got a year for shit to come up. If it's not going to work out, we find out before we actually get hit. Although I did move in about 4 months before we got married. We were that sure by that time. But but before the time I asked her to get married was probably about another year. Interestingly enough. Now, I had been single for 8 years. Very interesting thing. I had 2 periods where I would date a woman for about 3 months, and then it would fall apart. And then I would date another woman for 3 months, and then it would fall apart. And then I would date another woman. And then somebody said to me later, says, "Oh, that's the game you're playing. It's like you go see the same movie, but they have a different actress playing." And then somebody recommended this to me. I'll tell you, Jack, it was one of the toughest things to do in my life. And I did it for almost a year. Somebody says, go on a relationship fast. Just say to yourself, you're unavailable. Really get to know yourself. Spend time with yourself. Take walks in the woods and stuff. You don't have to do everything with other people. And see what changes. And the first 2 months were really rough. I'd get really like Friday. It's Friday night. It's time to go date somebody, and go out and have a few, have dinner and have a few and dance, party and da 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 da. And then I met another woman, and it lasted about 9 months, and then it broke up. But it was very different. There was a very, and I look back on it now almost laughingly. These 7, 8, 9, 10 women that over a 4-year period I dated for 3 months, and then I'd be in another relationship, all had very similar personalities and stories and dynamics of relationship. The one, and then at the end, and then I took another brief relationship fast, and then I met Pat.
Mhm.
It's weird that way, I guess. But yeah, that was a big thing for me for a while. And I've mentioned that to several people who said, sounds like a good idea. I just don't know if I could do it. It's like giving up sugar or something like that,
Yeah.
for some people, or smoking or whatever. Yeah, I know I should, but yeah, I don't know if it's possible. But it worked for me. It really did.
Well, now I met you in probably 2012 and in North Carolina, when Ellie and I were doing that presentation at the
I think, did you ever go to
hotel.
APA or craniosacral?
I went to the only APA I went to was in '95, where I met Prescott in San
Yeah,
Francisco.
and I've met Prescott. Yeah, I went to his house in Delaware.
Was that, were you there when Bruce Lipton and Margaret met? That was their big their honeymoon
Maybe.
effect.
I maybe. I mean, I got to tell you, I went to a lot of conferences, a lot of things. I was really seeking out, where's my tribe? And we haven't even talked about the whole craniosacral thing, and all the people. You probably don't know that many people in that crew, but they're all into.
Yeah,
But
I ran it.
Ray's part of that. He's an
Yeah.
RCFT. I was president of the association for about 3 years, like 2009 to 12 or something like that.
Now, did that come out of what's his name, the guy that went from Michigan to Florida?
Roger Gilchrist?
No, another doc.
No. As a
Who's
matter
the
of fact,
father of cranial sacral?
there's 2 schools of biocranial sacral therapy, and the guy you're talking about, which, gosh, I used to be able to pick off the top of my head, is one type, and then Franklin Sills doing on the work of Sutherland and other people come up with the biodynamic model. The first guy, who's passed away, by the way, and I met because he's done a lot of great work with veterans, and I liked what he did, but he was very mechanical about it at all.
Yeah.
And the reason he was mechanical is he wanted everything to be accepted by orthopedics guys, by doctors, and he wanted craniosacral therapy to be accepted as a medical specialty, like osteopathy. But MDs kind of look down their noses as osteopaths to begin with, and chiropractors are another step down, and craniosacral people are like way out in the woods, down there, hugging trees,
Well, now how does the other guy that Ray worked with, Peter Levine, fit in? That's parallel?
No, not at all.
Because Ray was working with Peter Levine when I met him, and I know he integrated that.
That didn't go on very long. And Peter Levine himself said this. He says, "I don't work well with others." And so John Chitty was working with him for a while. Some bunch of other people I know tried.
Well, Bob Scher actually did a really good book based on that. I met him through his wife.
But the problem with we even had a thing. It's like, I remember when we were doing our conferences for the biodynamic craniosacral, and there was always this rule to avoid Peter Levine types. And it came out from this thing where they had this conference. It was a combination polarity and biodynamic. and he had somatic experiencing, it was called, right?
Mhm.
By the way, I don't know what Peter Levine's doing these days, but he runs through, people come to work for him and then they quit, and people come to work for him and then they quit. But what it was, it was so he came for about a half a day, but then he stayed for less than half a day. But he was supposed to stay for the whole morning and give his speech to the craniosacral and polarity people. Apparently it was very good. And then they were going to have lunch, you know. But he started it out and he says, I'm here today to tell you what my work in somatic experiencing has to offer to craniosacral therapy and to polarity therapy. And he proceeded to do that. And he was asked a question that he didn't answer, and then somebody got him in the hall, and then they said, well, can we talk about it at lunch? And then he left early to catch his plane, so he didn't go to the lunch. But the question he was asked back was, can we tell you a little bit about how we think craniosacral or polarity may add to somatic experience? He says, no, I don't think, I'm not interested in having that discussion. It was very rude.
I had a
Very
similar
rude.
experience with Al Lowen, usually the founder of an organization.
Yes.
You know, and I believe you teach what you need to learn. So it's
Well,
often a part of our shadow.
Levine is he's so open. I don't think he knows how open he is. He's trying to monetize it so much, to the point where, you know, if it can't be monetized, it shouldn't be done, you know.
I can empathize with the desire to actually make a living doing your passion, which
no, we're talking about getting rich. We're talking about getting rich. You know.
Well, there's the polarity. There was someone else, Ray mentioned, and I worked with Rick and Steve Shim, who were in Mill Valley back in mid 70s. Yeah. But who was the other polarity guy? Big name.
Well, you're talking about Randolph Stone.
Yeah, Stone, and then there was another.
No, Stone was the founder of polarity therapy.
Yeah,
and I got into all of this because a lady from South Africa. It's a long story, but she had been in the ballet at South Africa. She had had an affair with a black man. She got ran out of South Africa because of that, because it was during apartheid. She went to London. She worked on Dr. Stone there, and then studied with him, and then came to America and lives out in near Charlottesville. And I went and took her courses she combined movement and polarity, and she called it synergy dance. It was good stuff, but
what's her name?
Huh?
What's her name?
Oh gosh.
Well, if you don't remember.
I know, I'm just having trouble pulling it up.
It sounds vaguely familiar from when I lived in Charlottesville, but
well, no, she was not exactly in Charlottesville. She was up the road a little bit, maybe 20 miles towards DC, because she lived in a very rural area.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a second. Jeez. I can't pull her name up. I've got all her videos and stuff.
So you were in getting involved in all of these formative somatic approaches to what holistic health.
Right. Very somatic.
Medicine, yeah. And
Charmaine Lee.
Oh, okay.
You ever heard of her?
Nope, haven't.
Look her up. But no, she and then I also got into a whole thing. I don't know if you have the Gabriella Roth 5 rhythms and all that kind of stuff going on, which is the whole idea of it is you cannot really totally heal something until you move it out in your body. Yeah. And I believe that's true. You have to do it through some sort of dance type thing. And I've been into that. But I've also been big into evolutionary psychology, which some people, Ray and Easler and David Loy were a couple, you know, and I met them at one, and I told them that I was interested, that I knew people, and I have books by the evolutionary psychologists and stuff like that. and he thinks they're all a bunch of bums, and I'm somebody with all this energetic stuff. And well, so from polarity, there was somebody in the polarity group that I took with Charmaine Lee, who had already done Roger Gilchrist's craniosacral therapy, and she highly recommended it to me. And so then I went from there to there, and it was through craniosacral that I got into birth. With somebody,
Okay.
so that was sort of the progression.
That's the
You know,
connection I was looking for.
yeah, that's the connection. But I'm bringing in my own stuff all the time, and even stuff from my mother and my mother's stories and stuff about obstetrics.
Well, that's clearly what got you started. I'm just curious whether Barbara Brennan's work is in there too, because that's another
Oh yeah.
about that and core energetics with Barakos and.
No, I never got into core energetics. I knew all about it. Barbara Brennan, I knew personally.
Is she not alive? I've had her on my list. You said in the past tense.
Barbara Brennan used to live up the street from me in, because she worked at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, and I lived in Greenbelt. This is before when I met Pat, and I forget how I met her a couple of times. Can I take a break? Like
sure.
30-second break. Okay. When Barbara Brennan was still working at NASA, she lived right around the corner from me and the person who introduced me to Pat, by the way. And so Barbara Brennan she created the Barbara Brennan School of Healing.
Yes.
Based on her books. And she was just getting started, and then she got bigger. And then there was one person who studied everything she did and then became her chief assistant trainer. And she was one of the 90-day wonders I was talking about recently. Laurie, I won't say the last name. And we dated for 3 months. That was in that, it all, but I didn't think much of it because, I mean, we would go to this sushi place, Laurie and Barbara and I and Nancy and some other people, we'd all just sit around and shoot the breeze about bioenergetics and things like that. I was always struck by all the people that I knew who were drawn to Barbara Brennan's type of work and anything to do with the bioenergetics and stuff like that. Some people would really be drawn into it, but everyday life had so much more impact. Somebody would get an illness, or somebody would have financial troubles, or somebody would have a nasty divorce. And all of a sudden, this thing that was number one in your life, I really want to study and understand the bioenergetics of the human system and how it interacts with other humans and blah, blah. And people would be in a really good place, but then they'd hit a bump in the road. It would happen to me too, like if I wasn't getting the consulting work that I needed, and wasn't making enough money. And it would distract me from all that and sort of make all of that kind of cool and kind of fun and kind of awe-inspiring even at times. But everyday life was about, gotta have a job, your relationship has to work, got to get along,
we've only got.
I know you've had some of that with family, and I have not experienced most of that because I've never had children. But
we've only got 15 minutes left. I've got another appointment, so I want to get to.
Where do you want to go?
Where if we've connected it with where you and I met, and then the work you've done with since then and organizing the various groups that you're cooking up. So where I first remember meeting you was at the what was it,
Postpartum Support International.
Yeah, PSA.
No, we had met before. You recognized me and I recognized you instantly. But maybe that was from Zoom. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I was there with Ellie, and she and you were connected. And so that she was the one that really connected me with you. And then we I think we met up where you and Suzanne started doing the
Right,
Birth Keepers, and
right.
you were in Berkeley when that meeting was.
Yep.
I gave a
Yeah,
presentation.
well, Susan Ann and I go back into the 90s somewhere. I
Yeah.
don't know. I couldn't tell you where it started. I've been out to her place in Colorado, and we've had long, long talks. Yeah.
So now, have you retired at this point, or were you still doing the counseling work when we
No,
met?
2005, I retired everything because I moved out of DC to South Carolina, and I'm
How'd
still
you
here.
happen to pick Conway, South Carolina? That's
Uh,
briefly.
Not that odd. Well, the whole Myrtle Beach area, Conway, I had never been to in my life.
Oh,
And a year or two before I moved here, if you had ever said I would move to South Carolina, in my impression of South Carolina, which is not too far off, it's very red, Trumpy state. I would say I'd never live there in a million years. But
there you are.
a friend of Pat's retired from teaching about 2.5 years before she did. They came to this area where we live now, and they invited us down to visit, and where we are, you've seen it, it's pretty
Yeah.
nice. We're
Beautiful.
probably in the bluest part of the South here, if any place can be. But
Oh,
the
Hopefully it's
ocean, the pine trees, the golf,
yeah.
and this is the first time in my life, and I've never lived anywhere longer in one particular place. I've been here 15 years in this
Wow.
house. We walked into this house that we bought, and we looked at each other. This is it. That happens sometimes.
Yeah.
And I've had some urges sometimes to move to like the West Coast, but I would never live in another house in this area. It wouldn't be worth the trouble of moving. But I sometimes think I'm not that happy living around all these rednecks, racists, and
Yeah.
it's pretty
Well,
bad.
now let's talk about Birth Keepers and how that.
Oh yeah.
That, yeah.
Well, there's Birth Keepers, which do you know Deb Puderball?
Only by email. We've not met.
Yeah, she's been very involved in APA. She's been, I mean, she's I think she's about 60, but for maybe 20 of the last 30 years, she's been president of the California Association of Midwives, among other things. She has this nonprofit that she was put in her lap by the estate of Dorothy Kilgallen. Do you know who that is?
Yeah.
And she left some land for a college and education and all that, but it's all, that's about all it is. And she's always trying to figure out what to do with it. Anyway, but Birth Keepers, it just seemed to come together.
Who came up with the name? Was that Deb?
Deb, but as soon as she said it, I said, "You're right," and so did Suzanne. I found out from talking to people, and I put Deb and Suzanne together, and I finally got a three-person call going one day, and then we met at a Napa conference, and then it was like, yeah, the three of us have something going on about organization and things like that. But Deb had never heard of ATLC. I had heard about it years back. I think many, many years ago, Suzanne, you sent me, go to the website, look at the principles and look at the goals, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I'm part of it. And she says, yeah, but it ain't nothing much anymore. They don't have meetings or conferences or anything like that. Do we have dues, ATLC?
No, we never did a membership.
Never, okay, so she says, so you're attuned to it, you're attuned to it. But then I took Birth Keepers a little step further, and it's going to be my thing. And it's called Birthright Keepers. And it's a simple idea that we owe to future human beings the best possible world and the best possible births and the best possible, like, what do you call it? The best possible attachment period,
Yeah.
cleanest
Primal
air, and it's a way of mitigating suffering, which is the Buddhist idea. Everything comes down to that, the mitigating suffering. And I've had personal things like dreams and impressions in my life where it's like, I'm supposed to do this. It's different than Birth Keepers. Birth Keepers is all about, a better experience in having a baby, basically, and in raising them in the early months. Birthright Keepers is more about a philosophy of life, and it's just as interested in puberty as it is in and preconception than it is with the delivery room. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
A lot of these organizations, they want to be about a wide spectrum, but the people are OB nurses, midwives, doulas, people like that, and it really gets focused to, like, the birth and the attachment period, first year. So I'm not there yet. I have to say, if you're not there yet, you might not make it to the next day. I could get COVID-19. Guy down the street did. I think I mentioned that.
Well, you're keeping your vitamin D level up, I hope.
Yeah, right here. Got the, yeah. I'm really taking precautions. I'm not talking to people without 6 feet of distance, much less a mask, and but it's the thing has a life of its own. I will say this, and I should mention this to you. I really got the impression this is the Map of Consciousness by David R. Hawkins, MD,
Yeah.
PhD, very famous guy. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's got a
Oh,
lot
yeah.
of, huh?
I'm familiar with his scale. Yeah.
Yeah. This book, though, has a 2020 copyright. He died in 2012, and the book is very well done. There's an introduction that is basically an overview of all of his life's work and puts it together. There's a biography of him by Susan, his wife. There's one other person has done all these Q&As, and what would David say about this? What would David say about that? What does the whole level thing even mean? It kind of is like the Omega to all the stuff that I read, starting with Brave New World some 55 years ago. And so I've been, my book is called More Conscious, More Often. It's really, yeah, no, it's a story of my personal intellectual journey, kind of like you're asking me, but very specific. So I take the books, maybe 7 or 8 of them, that have really made a difference in my life, changed my thinking, changed my direction, changed my way of being in the world, and describing them, and then describing my progression in life. And at the same time, promoting the idea of an organization called Birthright Keepers, where you say, my number one priority in my life is improving the conditions of birth for future human, and that even includes probably trying to reduce population, which is very easy to do if only wanted people are born.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
They just come in together, and that's something that we all want. Only people who are wanted should be born, and then we'll have fewer people at the same time.
Now, you mentioned that you are writing a book. This is
I'm probably 2/3 of the way through writing this. It changes what it is. It started out a long time ago as the first name, listen to this, it's called Honorable Symptoms.
Interesting.
I tried that. That was my original title in 1990. This is the same book I'm working on. But basically that came from even from my grandmother, I got things like, when you get sick, don't treat the symptoms, they're making you well.
Yeah, good for
Just
her.
homespun,
Yeah.
Appalachian, like, this is just common sense. This ain't no thing you got to get a degree.
Yeah.
Just use your head. And my mother picking up some, but then my mother got into the Western medicine. It's going to solve all my problems. It's going to keep me young. It's going to do this. As I get old, it's going to fix everything.
Well, we've got to wrap up here. I've only got 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. Okay. So let's talk about this book I'm writing, which I hope to be done with within a year.
Oh, good.
It's my only real product. And several times I've said, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? And I said, at one time I was going to write 3 different books. And then I realized on a hiking trip, it's all one book with 3 parts.
Yeah,
and one of the parts is literally what's called Bravest New World, which assumes that all the stuff that we know we should do, we do. And then 100 years go by, how does the world look? So that's the kind of stuff that's fun for me to do. I've written a lot of that, but it's the second part of the book, and part of it's my story, then it's this story. And then it's also, I'm kind of doing what you're doing. I'm trying to do a history. Well, the one book I was going to do was called The Whole Birth Catalog, the 2020 edition, which was going to like write everybody up. Basically a book review of everybody from David Chamberlain to Ray Castellino to Barbara Harper, anything, I wanted all these people to have proper notice, a little bit of a biography, a little bit of a book review, summation of the key points and stuff. That's always been a goal of mine. So I've been, how does this all fit into some one thing? And it's always about condensation, succinctness, and it can always be simpler than you did it the last time. One more draft. And it can be for the layman. So
well,
more conscious, more often.
What parting wisdom would you like to leave for our viewers who've come after us? We hope this will endure, and when we're memories, what would you say are your gifts of wisdom that you'd like to? 25 words or less, because I got to wrap up.
Okay. Can I just think for like 5 seconds?
You can have 10 seconds.
Okay. It's in the title of the book, More Conscious, More Often.
Oh, brilliant.
I want myself, but I also want you and all our fellow humans who are willing to simply be more aware of themselves and what makes them tick, so to speak.
Beautiful.
And we are constantly distracted. We don't do it enough. None of us do it enough. Not enough of us do it at all. And the only way out is to start in that direction.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. That's
does that work?
Great way to wrap it up.
How do I get a copy of this?
I'll send you a link.
I tried to record it and said I needed your permission.
Yeah, well, no, that'll be on the web. So
will you send me a copy before you put it on the web?
Well, it's already recorded to the cloud, so you can get it off of that.
But
I got to wrap up. So thank you, and
okay.
I will end the recording now. And best wishes.
Best wishes to you too. Let's talk more often.
Yeah,
we have lots to talk about from the old days.
Stop meeting me.
Talk to me after you talk to Barbara Brennan.
Okay.
Take
Bye.
care.